Okay, we'll get going this evening. Apologize for those watching at home for starting a few minutes late, but appreciate everybody being here this evening for a report from Matrix Consulting regarding an overtime report that was commissioned and has been studied over the last several months. Before we get going, we'll start with our City Manager, John Bohanko, who will introduce the speakers for the evening.
Thank you, Your Honor. But before I introduce the speakers, I thought it would be useful to go over some of the timeline that we had relative to this report. If you recall, back in November of 2005, at a City Council work session, you unanimously agreed to direct me as a City Manager to move forward with a citywide overtime study for all City departments, including fire, police, municipal, and schools. In December of 2005, the City staff issued a request for proposals. In January, on January 17th, the key department heads involved in the overtime study interviewed 3 firms who submitted proposals and chose Matrix Consulting to move forward with the engagement. On January 23rd, 2006, the City Council authorized the City Manager to expend up to $60,000 in contingency funds to fund the overtime study, and the project was to begin work in February. On March 20th, 2006, Matrix presented its charge to the City Council and in a work session and explained its approach before a regular City Council meeting. At that time, the City Council also provided its input about the issues of overtime. April 18th, the firm presented a draft final report to key department heads, and this evening, Matrix Consulting will be giving us a final report, but I would put the caveat that we have not accepted the final report, nor would I indicate that we should tonight. I think we just want to make sure that before we finally accept the report that we assure that all the data within it, we vetted it so that we make sure before we put it on the website and everything, before we publicly distribute this, that all data is been checked and rechecked, because I think it's important to many of the departments who have worked very hard to assure that the data is accurate. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all the departments, many of which are here today, department heads and board and commission members, for the work that they've done on this. Because of the tight time frame and the compressed time frame, it took a lot of a juggling of schedules, and certainly we appreciate that effort that was made so that you could have this report within the tight time frame that was provided. So at this point, I'd like to have Richard Brady come forward, along with William Gay, who will be supporting him in this presentation from Matrix Consulting.
We'll leave Bill Gay on the chair and have him come up when we have questions and answers. Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, thank you very much for having us here again before you tonight. I'm Richard Brady. I'm the president of Matrix Consulting Group, and I was the project manager on this assignment. Bill Gay is a senior manager with the firm, and he was one of the 4-person team that we had on this assignment besides myself and him. We had Susanna Lee and Alan Pennington from our firm who worked on this project. We spent 2 months on this project. It was a compressed time frame for us and for your staff, and it was difficult for your staff to work with us in that amount of time, because as you can see from the, I think, almost 220-page report, there's a lot of information that we had to collect, and it would not have been possible for us to do that without the help and the cooperation of staff, particularly the staff in the larger departments, where the information about workloads and service levels was so important to what we do. I think I'd also have to say we appreciate the tight timeline that you've had to review this, because I think you only just got this report, so I won't be quizzing you, so you can spend as much time as you want quizzing me on this this evening. I thought it might make some sense to spend a couple of minutes. Right one, is it working? There we go. Reminding you what you asked us to do and talk a little bit about how we conducted the study. This is an important issue not just for you, but it's the kind of issue that we spend a lot of our time evaluating on behalf of our clients. And the reason for that is pretty simple. One is that overtime in most organizations costs a lot of money, and inadequate controls over overtime are the kinds of things that get people on page 1 of the newspaper in an undesirable kind of way. So this is a very important issue. I think you have taken this more seriously than most of our clients because this study was really just about overtime. Usually it's about management, staffing, and operations, of which overtime is a component of that. So we had 4 principal things that we needed to look at as part of the study that you asked us to look at. One is a general study of key overtime issues in all of the departments within the city, looking at its causes, looking at the amounts of overtime by type, and importantly, how managers and supervisors control it within an organization. Because it's typically a bigger issue for the bigger departments, we spent most of our time working with police, fire, and public works and how they use overtime to meet service level expectations within the community, how they use overtime at times to meet emergency and other kinds of needs out there. And in any community that we work with, these are the larger issues within any organization because, again, they're the largest departments in most cities. There are 24/7 kinds of operations, so that except for public works, but certainly in police and fire, they're staffing around the clock and have emergencies and other kinds of special needs that they need to meet. Sometimes they can do that with on-duty staffing, sometimes they can't, and those are some of the reasons why overtime is generated. You asked us to compare overtime and compensatory time to other communities in New England. We did that. We also compared the way you control overtime and overtime use to what we call best practices in the industry. It doesn't have anything to do with any particular agency out there. It's based on our decades of experience of what some of the best agencies are doing out there, what professional associations are arguing are things that you should do to control overtime and compensatory time. And we looked at alternatives and developed performance standards for you. Some of those were based on the best practices, but some of them were based on our own independent analytical effort. And these were ways to reduce overtime and compensatory time or better control it within the organization. I think we'd like to think that what you get out of this report are some short-term things that you can do to better control overtime, but also a manual for you to use as you go through future collective bargaining agreement negotiations, as situations change within the city. What we did to conduct this study, extensive interviews throughout the organization, first of all, about 50 interviews throughout the city in every department. Clearly, again, a lot of interviews within the larger departments, but we use the interviews as a way not just to understand how overtime is used and controlled, but to understand something about operations, because unless we have an understanding of the organizational structure, what service level expectations are within the city, how you manage operations on a day-to-day basis, how you deal with emergencies, whether it's snow or other kinds of emergencies in public works, or whether it's huge calls for service, even regional kinds of issues in police and fire, we needed to understand how you deal with those kinds of issues. We collected a lot of information. Clearly, we were pretty heavily dependent on the Finance Department and Human Resources Department that collects a lot of information on overtime use within the city by type. But with the larger departments, some of them, particularly Police Department, does a really good job of collecting information about the type of overtime, the specific uses to which it's put, the conditions under which it's utilized, etc. But we also collected a lot of information just about the organization, about staffing, deployment, scheduling, about service levels, again, to back up the interviews so that we had a good understanding of what some of the causes were from our own perspective and what were some operational things that you could consider to address some of the overtime and compensatory time issues that we came up with as well. We looked at policies and procedures, both citywide kinds of policies as well as standard operating procedures and policies within each individual department, as well as took home a very large manual with all 15 collective bargaining agreements in them and studied those quite carefully to look at what commitments you've made legally in those kinds of documents and what kind of issues existed out there with respect to the future control of overtime and compensatory time in the organization. As I said earlier, we compared you to other New England communities. We used as our starting point the communities that you compare yourselves to for other purposes, particularly for pay and employee classification kinds of issues. So that was about a half a dozen communities in New Hampshire, but other communities in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut as well. We looked pretty heavily at what managers and supervisors do to control overtime and monitor it. And we looked at alternatives to reduce overtime while retaining existing service levels within the community. I think it's important to put a best foot forward in all of this because clearly most of what we spend our time in a 200-plus page report, almost 200-page report doing is looking at improvement opportunities within the organization. But getting within an organization to the extent we did, you find lots of things that all of our clients, and you included, do well. And so we don't spend a lot of time doing that, spending a lot of time in a report recapitulating what that is. So what we made sure that we did is put in one place in the executive summary a list of very positive things that you do. And there's some very important ones that lead to our bottom line conclusion that while there's some issues that we wanted to look at with respect to amount and utilization and ways of controlling overtime and compensatory time, you're well on the way to achieving that within the organization. Some of the things that we'd like to point out here is, first of all, there's less publicly supported overtime in police than the other communities that we compared you to, about 20% less when you factor out the private details in terms of looking at publicly paid overtime to meet minimum staffing levels or for emergency incidents. And that's pretty significant. In public works, it's less than the benchmark level, much less so, about 2%, but the fact that it's less is a positive thing as well. You have a centralization in the way you deal with the way private details are accounted for and managed. And that may sound like a trivial issue, but it's pretty unusual, particularly in New England, where in many communities, even the union is responsible for billing and accounting for private details, and that is not a best practice, but it's pretty common in the Northeast. But you have a centralized way of accounting for it, for billing it, and collecting it in the finance department, which is a very positive thing. Managers throughout the city have access to online budgetary reports that gives them limited but some information on the amount of overtime that's being used, how it compares to budgeted expenditures, and gives them some power of information about trends, how it compares to beginning of the budget year kinds of commitments to something like this that a lot of other communities don't have. In terms of comparing you to what we think some of the best practices are, not just to other communities, you're using your labor agreements to spell out in a very detailed way the control, the use, the appropriate situations, et cetera, for the use of overtime and compensatory time. So it's in the agreement. There's not a lot of room for ambiguity about that. So that's very positive. Several departments, particularly police, but also fire, have spelled out in their own policies, standard operating procedures, et cetera, the appropriate uses and controls of overtime, supervisory methods to keep on top of using overtime for response, for writing reports, for processing a call after the shift is over if it entails an arrest or something like that, and appropriate times to use compensatory time to minimize the use of overtime. Those kind of policies are in place. And this city does a good job compared to many of our clients of continually looking at ways of using alternative shift schedules, different ways of deploying staff, different ways of meeting special assignment kinds of needs to impact overtime. The first step that we looked at in terms of coming up with some improvement opportunities within the city on overtime and compensatory time relates to collective bargaining agreements. And this is important to recognize in this study. There are very few things that you could make a decision in the short term associated with this study and have it implemented in terms of reduction in overtime. Most of the controls, as I mentioned a minute ago, relate to what's in place in terms of your collective bargaining agreements. So there are things that you should do with respect of your collective bargaining agreements that can help you over the longer term to reduce overtime, hopefully, or better control it in some way. But you're going to have to go through some sort of process, whether it's an interim kind of meet and confer kind of process or dealing with it when the employee contract is up. But there are 4 or 5 things that we've suggested you do with respect to all of your agreements, but especially some of the larger ones relating to getting greater flexibility in scheduling so that you're able to stagger shifts, so that you're able to utilize management rights to change schedules on a short-term or more permanent kind of basis to meet various kinds of service needs, seasonal kinds of changes, special events, special assignments, and things like that, and to better define special assignments so that you can have them as collateral duties or pull people off shift to do things in a more flexible way than you can do that right now. Secondly is to better negotiate how you calculate overtime so that various kinds of leave, sick leave, and things like that, if it's used in a week or another defined pay period, so that it's not included in the base, so that somebody's taking 2 or 3 days of sick leave and they come back on a day that they're not scheduled and it automatically counts as overtime. That's increasingly a way that cities are using to control overtime across the United States and in New England as well. Thirdly is to negotiate and better define where you can ways of paying people for standby time and getting more consistent and hopefully lower where they're higher right now, the minimum amounts that are being paid for overtime, and not uniformly bringing people in 4 hours automatically when they get the job done in 1 hour or something like that. And that's another management control that cities and towns are increasingly getting implemented in their labor agreements. Negotiate and expand the use of acting pay. This is an area that is increasingly common outside of New England. It's getting a little more common within New England and Massachusetts, where you're able to bring people in. You avoid bringing people in on an overtime basis like supervisors or special assignment people, and you have people act essentially out of class and assume the pay of that position for a period when there's not a supervisor, for example, available. So it saves you an overtime shift where you are over deployed for, let's say, a police officer. You can't do that with everybody, but for people who have received training to be a first-line supervisor in some limited kind of way, a seasoned officer sometimes is defined for as 10 or 15 years experience or something like that. It's a very important way of getting control over overtime on a shift-by-shift basis. Lastly, and this really falls more on the general municipal departments than it does for police and fire, is to better control compensatory time. Many of the cities that we worked with in a comparative survey simply do not have compensatory time. They pay any unusual or overshift kind of time. And that's a decision you may or may not want to take. We think that it's appropriate to have some compensatory time, but use it flexibly to meet certain kinds of more limited needs, such as after-hour meetings, for people administrative staff taking minutes, or for management staff who have irregular kinds of compensatory time, and sometimes regular kinds of time as well. There are some things that you need to do with respect to policies. I'd call them more sort of the high-level, common kind of statements that you can control through general city policies. Clearly, the more detailed things that are coming at the departmental level, specific to departments in standard operating procedures, in collective bargaining agreements and the like. But in one place that you should define that overtime is not a right, it's something that exists for purposes of meeting special needs within the city, what the situations are, the process for approving it, the process for monitoring it, and these should be in citywide employee policies, like an employee handbook, that type of environment. So that could relate to things like appropriate uses, maximum overtime. Some of them may be restatements of the things that are in some of the collective bargaining agreements as well. In terms of monitoring and reporting of overtime, I mentioned that departments get a limited amount of overtime through the financial management information system that you have in place, Penimation. But either through use of that financial management system or with separate databases, you need some more information. Right now, it's pretty inconsistent. A couple of the departments, particularly police, go to some length to track overtime by cause, amount, by person, etc. You need to do that on a citywide basis. So we've recommended some specific reports so that you better understand overtime use by department and by cause of overtime. Same thing by employee, so that you're able to get information on the high users of overtime within a pay period or within a month or a quarter or something like that. To compare overtime and leave reporting on an individual as well as a function on a departmental basis, and to focus on compensatory time earned, used, and accrued by employee and departmentally. Right now, this represents an unfunded liability for the city because you really don't know the total amount of compensatory time that's on the books within the city right now. As I said, we also looked at operational issues because sometimes it takes changing the way you do business in order to get changes in overtime. So we looked at a number of issues within the city in terms of particularly police, fire, and public works, how they provide services to the public, and some implications about how they've organized themselves, how they've structured services being delivered to the public that has an impact on overtime. I think the first issue is an interesting one. And I think we can contrast how you manage to staff operations and deploy operations in police with fire. Both are 24-hour emergency operations. In the police department, in patrol, on the other 24/7 operation, you have a built-in relief factor that you can use to manage the day-to-day fluctuations in the number of people available because of sick leave, vacation, etc. So overtime level to meet minimum staffing in police is not unusual. The amount of overtime in fire, on the other hand, is unusual because while you have a slightly different way of staffing the day shift and night shift, you essentially have authorized a number of people to staff each shift as you need to staff them. The authorized number is equal to the number that you need. So on any shift, you're automatically in an overtime situation. And there are a number of issues behind that. I mean, it makes overtime look artificially high when, in fact, all you're doing is staffing your service commitment in terms of stations and apparatus that you've got online within the city. But you have some other risk out there in terms of burning out your staff who essentially could work multiple shifts in a week and not be as fresh as they need to be for an emergency situation. And this is a risk management issue that is of growing importance nationwide, and it's something that most communities are trying to control. So what we're recommending here is a substitution of overtime with additional staff. It'll cost about another couple $100,000 a year to hire one firefighter for each of the 4 shifts, but you will have a commensurate reduction in overtime because you won't have to hire that extra person per shift. You'll still have overtime, and it'll still amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But this is a way of addressing the freshness, the team integrity that is so important in the fire service, so that you've got one team that's training together all the time. Also in the fire department, as I mentioned earlier, we've recommended that you, through collective bargaining, look at ways of getting firefighters to work out of class for short periods of time so that you're not calling back employees within a classification to staff a shift, and that can have some impacts as well. In the police department, we think that this is important enough within police, not just in patrol, but for other overtime situations, to have one designated person as a collateral duty, typically a sergeant, who is monitoring, tracking, and reporting on overtime for the department and to the city on whatever basis, quarterly, or even monthly or annually, that you feel is appropriate, but that person should be tracking it on a week-to-week basis. Next, while we had only limited access to certain kinds of information within the police department as part of this study, because we weren't doing a full management, staffing, and operations study, there's some indication that there you need to look at your deployment levels versus the call for services workload and how proactive you want people to be in the community. Essentially, you should be doing a workload and staffing study, which could have an impact on overtime if you're assigning more people to a particular time of day than is required by the service commitment and the workloads that are out there. Next, you're training your dispatchers at a level that's quite a bit higher than the benchmark communities are doing, and compared to the best practices that are out there, APCO standards and the like. That's the Professional Association for Emergency Dispatchers. So we're recommending cutting that back a little bit, a couple shifts a year, and that would save you some overtime as well. Also in the police department, we've recommended that, again, this is through collective bargaining, that you limit the number of overtime hours that can be worked in a pay period. You do have limits on a day, but not on a week and a month, and this is an important concept that you need to do, again, as with the fire example, to maintain the freshness, integrity of the people who are in the field. In public works, as I mentioned before, this is certainly a case for them that they need more information. Compared to police and fire, they don't collect the information that they do with respect to what causes overtime, who's earning it, et cetera. So they need to do a better job collecting that, and they need to continually explore different kinds of scheduling approaches to make sure that that's being utilized effectively. So in general, you know, I think in terms of the general municipal departments, they're mostly compensatory time situations and not overtime situations. So we looked at a number of issues associated with when it's appropriate, when it's not, when you should have flexibility, and when you should just pay people to be there. You know, I guess in summary, I think that there's a lot of things that you're doing well now as a city in terms of managing and monitoring overtime. The issue is that it's more informal than it should be, and it's not as consistent as it should be. So you need to address some of those short-term and long-term issues with a view to having more power with the information that you need to know where and how overtime is used and how to control it throughout the organization. So again, thank you for having us here this evening. And again, I want to thank staff again for all the work that they did helping us get to creating this analytical document for you. So now Bill and I would like to answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Appreciate it very much. And one thing I'll preface, I don't know how long we'll be here doing Q&A. I may have to depart for another obligation before the 8 o'clock hour, and if so, then Tom will keep all the lions in check. That's the assistant mayor. Anyway, with that, anybody that would like to kick it off that has a question or comment, the assistant mayor, please, you kick it off.
Thank you, Your Honor. First of all, I appreciate your presentation, appreciate the hard work, and I will look forward to reading it in more depth. And I don't know what the forum will be to further question once we've had an opportunity to review the report. But I do have a general one, probably too general. And that is, out of all of the issues that you saw, what percentage of the changes that we can make that would have a direct financial impact are collective bargaining agreement driven?
Without naming a specific percentage, it's going to be the majority.
Great. Well, is it more than 50%? Yes. Is it more than 60%? You know.
Let me, if I might, Your Honor, I think it's important because as we were going through this report and as we were developing it, staff sat down and when we had the first draft, it was best practices, but they never identified collective bargaining issues.
Right. So
what we did is we asked them to identify those specifically because, you know, even if it's 60, 70, whatever the number is, this is, and in the executive summary, you'll see what we asked for. Specifically, I asked the consultant to put this in this format so that you have, so when we start sitting down with the city negotiator as the city council with the boards and commissions, then this will be a template that you can use. And, you know, it might sit on the shelf for a couple months or 3 months, but then you can pull it off the shelf, you know, go to the pages page 5 and look at some of those things. And when you sit down with the city negotiator and with the respective boards and commissions, then you can go through and ask that these items be looked at within the collective bargaining agreement. So that was the key that we wanted, because we didn't want the council to get a list that said certain best practices without having them know that there's collective bargaining associated with it. And that's a good question that the assistant mayor had, and I think you would find it is a majority. One of the things that I will say within the comp time issue, we're already working on that, and so I see that a policy be made in place for that, and we're going to try to unify that where there are no collective bargaining agreements that would affect that. The one thing I would have to state on that is that much of the comp time is we do not backfill in employees to those areas. From police department doesn't, public works doesn't, management doesn't. What happens is when people take comp time, we don't fill those shifts. So, for example, if somebody takes comp time in public works, that doesn't get filled. The overtime that we majority have, and speaking to Mr. Brady, 80% of our overtime or 70% of our overtime in public works is snow related. We typically do not fill when somebody's out sick, somebody's on vacation. Very rarely will we fill that unless it's a very, very specific job. But certainly, we have the capability in Pentimation to do it. One of the questions that came up, or one of the comments that came up is, well, our staff, our department employees, the department heads are actually entering that information into Pentimation every 2 weeks. So they'll know, basically what they have. But certainly, a report is something to have from a historical perspective that we'll be working on as well. But the key issue here is the collective bargaining issues that now, this report, 3 months from now, we can go back to and look at. The other things that aren't collective bargaining issues that affect municipal side, we're already working on. I can't speak to other departments specifically, but on the municipal side, I'll be working with the human resources, and it's like the audit report, we start working on that immediately. But
in the absence of a situation that happens sometimes when we do these studies of some kind of abuse of overtime, particularly where there's some pattern to it, which is something we did not find in this study. What comes out of this study is twofold, and there are some things that you can do short term to at least have better information about where the overtime is being earned or used and why. And so those are things you could do relatively short term to get the information. Some of the policies that aren't specifically tied to collective bargaining agreements, you could do tomorrow. A simple statement about overtime, your right as an employee to have it, and how we're going to evaluate it and oversee it. That's a simple statement that you could write short term, and it would be on a page or two rather than an employee having to go through a standard operating procedures kind of document or the collective bargaining agreement. A simple statement that defines overtime and compensatory time is something that you can do tomorrow. The collective bargaining agreements are things that I think that you were very wise, I think, as a city to use this study as a way to provide an encyclopedic approach for you to say, well, what's really going to be important for us in the future in terms of getting management controls over things that have an impact on the cost and the way we provide services. The last set of things that we looked at, the operational issues, are a mixed bag of things. Some of them relating even to some deployment things, but also some special assignments. You've got the power of a city to look at tomorrow within a department or as a city. You got the power to look at in the next budget. Some of them are wrapped up into the collective bargaining agreement relating to on-duty staffing levels and things like that. So we tried not to look for the magic bullet of what you can do tomorrow, but look for things that would have longer-term kind of use for you.
Very good. Councilor Dwyer.
Let me ask a question about that in terms of a specific example in collective bargaining. And I come at this as an employer who's dealt with these issues for over 20 years, so I'm a little surprised at things like the need to better define how overtime is calculated. If I understand what you said, we don't necessarily require someone to work the work week before we calculate overtime. And I'm wondering if things need to be left to collective bargaining if they are absent definition rather than so specified.
If it's specified, you have to go through the collective bargaining agreement process.
But take that example.
Or if it's prevailing practice, you're going to have to talk to them about it.
Okay. And that's prevailing practice,
Right.
is what you're saying. That
Yeah.
example is prevailing practice.
Oh, it's both. It's both.
It's both,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, Councilor Reynolds.
Yeah, the collective bargaining agreements very carefully define how overtime is to be paid out for all of the agreements that you have.
Okay. I had two questions. One is, could you, particularly it goes right to the recommendation that we should hire an additional firefighter on each shift to convert the overtime to straight time. I'm fairly confident that, because your professional has been at this a long time, that you did this, but could you just assure us that in making that recommendation, you accounted for all the cost of hiring that additional person? In other words, not just their salary, but what we put in other benefits and what goes in the retirement system and everything, just that you looked at the whole package.
Before Bill adds more depth to that answer, there's a 12-page spreadsheet that backs that up. That was a very important part of our analysis.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a loaded figure that we have in there for hiring the additional personnel. So it includes all the benefits that go with the basic pay for these personnel.
And those benefits include the contribution to the retirement system and everything else
Yeah.
will ever.
One of the things I think is important, and just to add to that, though, they take a look at the individual as a 1 or 2 year employee. One of the things you'll find in the collective bargaining agreements in the fire department is that there are multiple stipends within the department. So because of the way the federal wage law is now, even though it's called a stipend, it needs to be rolled in as your hourly rate. So as you become more experienced and you add more stipends to your skill level, you could end up having a situation where their numbers, when you extrapolate them out maybe 7 years or 9 years, and find that those same 4 firefighters may cost you a lot more than what is in their first 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, another question. Yeah.
Another question. Went to the last recommendation about Public Works Department should continue to explore alternative approaches to scheduling, which could impact the use of overtime. Is it correct to say that what you're getting at there is that there may be the same kind of matching issue
No.
as in the police department?
No, this one's a little bit different. This is really about getting weekend coverage and seasonal coverage that they do, like in a plant. They stagger shifts so that people can cover, on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday.
One of the things I'll add to that is, as we have become, as a city, we've become more, it used to be the police and fire were 24/7. As the type of city we are today, we are in the public works area more and more. I mean, most council members realize, the number of special events that take place on the weekend. We need to, again, work with our union to collectively bargain and have the ability to work outside the regular hours of operation. We started that with the recycling. We also do something that's a little unique, and I think we talked about it, is on our supervisors. We have a shift where supervisors may work Tuesday through Saturday, and so that you're covering on the weekends. And then so those areas that we're already looking at, but that is an area that is going to be subject to collective bargaining with our union, and we certainly will look at that. We talked about it at length in the last collective bargaining discussion, and we were able to work with them on new employees, a new recycling center, to have those types of adjustments. And I think what we're talking about is the ability to put people on second shift and on a regular, in certain areas. We already do that in some areas already.
Okay, so it's not the matching staffing levels to workload, varying workload, as much as negotiating alternative ways to schedule
Right.
that accommodates the reality of
Yeah.
public works being more 24/7.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Whitehouse.
Yes, did you get a chance to look at a charter? Because much is regulated what we can do and can't do by what is stated in the charter. especially when it comes to negotiating with the unions.
You're absolutely right, and we did look at the charter.
Do you recommend any changes?
We did not recommend any changes to the charter because that's
out
a
of your
little bit
scope.
more difficult process
I see.
than the collective bargaining agreement.
All right, thank you.
Good question. Councilor Dwyer.
I just glanced at a couple of the tables in there related to a question I had asked at the interim time, which is the pattern of overtime by classification of employee. And am I right in saying that generally the pattern is considerably more for higher level employees than for lower ranking and lower paid employees?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, overtime, that the overtime hours are not equally distributed
Oh, right.
among different levels and salary ranges of employees
Well, and personal choice.
and personal choice. But is it right to say that there's about, a higher ranking employee might have about twice as many overtime hours as a lower ranking employee?
Not always.
No, that's not the case. It varies substantially in each of those employee classes, and that's laid out in several of the tables in the report. It's kind of a random event that people are offered overtime on an equal basis. They have the opportunity to accept that overtime or reject it. As you'll see in the report in some of the tables, you have some folks within all ranks that take a lot of overtime, and you'll have other employees who take very little overtime and do very little detail work. So there's nothing that crops up and says that
No.
most of the overtime is going to
But
higher ranking personnel.
I can see where you're asking that because we have made some recommendations that sort of mirror that, like the acting pay out of class and getting some other kinds of flexibility and schedule to cover that. But that those recommendations are made as ways of just generally controlling overtime, not because it's so much higher consistently for supervisory classifications than it is for
That's my
line
question, and at each of the 4 or 5 tables that I've glanced at, the pattern is so obvious that there seems to be, and I don't know if it's because it's done by individual or because it's done as a total across the class.
Oh, Councilor, what pages are you looking at?
Just like page 81 or page 82 or any of those, and I might not be reading those tables, or page 80, if I'm not reading those tables correctly.
You're on page 80?
Yeah, just let's look at 80, because, I mean, it's a similar table used a number of times.
Page 80 refers to the ranking officers, distribution of overtime amongst those ranking officers.
Right.
I think he's saying it's not the ranking with the most, not people who are higher ranking used more, but just that there were certain ranking officers that used a lot more, and certain ones that used
Yes.
less.
Right.
And you're
We're-
saying that.
Yeah,
that
what
may
may
be
be
choice.
confusing on table, we have in there something called high-ranking officer.
Right, that's
And that's
my
just
question.
the ranking officer who had the most overtime. It doesn't mean he was a
Got
captain
it.
rather than
Okay.
sergeant. That's a little
Okay.
confusing.
So then my question goes back to the answer you gave before, that you found it was randomly distributed across the different levels of salary. I mean, that's really the question, that, are you paying the highest amount of overtime on the highest salary, or is it randomly distributed?
It's not completely random because you've got fewer supervisors than you do line
Right.
people, but it's
Pretty random.
It's pretty random.
One of the other things I think is important, I don't want to speak for the police department, but I know they're doing a pilot program with their ranking officers on 10-hour days. And
Right.
that's something to address some of these issues. So everybody's really looking at this, it's not just, but yeah, it's something.
And that's an interesting idea on their part. It's somewhat controversial in law enforcement. I like it. What it does is it gives, because they've got different start times and stop times from the shifts that they're supervising, it doesn't get the high level of buy-in into a single shift. It really gets them to cross over a shift, and that has some real advantages to an organization.
One follow-up to Councilor Dwyer, I just wanted to ask, and you may have answered it, but just for clarification, is while it sounds like there aren't distinct patterns, let's say, it's fairly random in terms of as you go up in pay, there's more overtime or something like that. Is there any kind of relationship that you noticed, not necessarily based on pay, but based on seniority?
We didn't look at seniority, but we did look at the high overtime generators within each function, and I'm sure that is a factor, but we didn't pursue why some people were getting more overtime than others, because a lot of it was income driven or personal preference driven or something like that.
Your Honor, I'd like to just draw the City Council attention to page B25, just to correct something, because it was brought to my attention before. It's just a typo on B25, because it is important to note that the police department, on that chart, it should say, instead of hours of overtime, it should say hours of leave. Okay, so that
page
changed.
is that?
That's on B25. B as in boy. So that should actually, and we'll get an addendum out, but again, this was something that was, obviously, we're trying to compress the time to get it to you.
Don't put me the whole book. I don't want the whole book, just the,
I understand. I won't give you the whole book.
all right, John.
An addendum.
There we go. Okay,
He's save our trees.
let me go to the Assistant Mayor. I saw your hand.
Thank you, Your Honor. With respect to compensatory time, understanding that there's a state law wages and hours law on the books, in private companies, people giggle about compensatory time. It doesn't happen until you get down to a certain level of clerical or administrative worker. Is there a collective bargaining agreement that covers higher level municipal workers? There is. So are we CBA'd right up to underneath the city manager? So all of the comp time is driven by those contracts, even at that managerial level?
Yes.
Okay.
And there is a declining scale for that comp time. You'll find, and it's something we can go into when we talk about the collective bargaining, but there is, it is not on a one-for-one typically or time and a half. It has a declining scale to it. So, for example, if you go to X amount of meetings a year, then you have a certain level. Then as you get to another level, it goes down. So if you have the unfortunate situation where you're at 30 night meetings a year, the maximum that you actually can earn is, I believe, 13 total.
Is our CBA in excess of what the state law allows for management in what I mean by that is, the state law requires a certain amount of compensatory time for an individual who is a salaried employee acting in a management fashion. Does our collective bargaining agreement with our municipal department head level people grant more time, a more liberal granting of compensatory time, or is it the same? Or does it fit with that?
It fits with that.
Okay. And the other thing I would say about that, all the people I've dealt with over the last 9 years that are in management positions, they've got a job to do.
Right.
So it doesn't, they'll be taking time, because the other thing what you've done in the collective bargaining agreement is you've capped the amount of time that can be carried over. So what consequently happens towards the end of the year, in December, they're taking a lot of time. But I will tell you this, there have been many days where somebody's out on comp time that I've been talking to. So, on the one hand, yes, we do provide that in the collective bargaining for the management. But on the other hand, you have to realize that most of these people don't use much of it too. They lose a lot of it as well. So, and they use it, and then again, when they're needed, they're there. So, and we don't. So, for example, if the planner's not in on a day, we don't have the planner. We don't fill in a planner for that individual for overtime. Right. And if there's a major question, he gets a phone call. So
that most of the controllable compensatory time relates to doing minutes, administrative types of after-hour types of responsibilities, and it is managers. And I think where you really want to control it even more is what you've already done, and is pretty much eliminated every place else.
And then pay the overtime.
And pay the overtime.
We're starting to pay the overtime.
Right.
Any other hands? Actually, let me ask one other question while people percolate over any other questions they might have. Something that was alluded to briefly, and I understand was not the primary scope of the study. Obviously, with the fire department, there was a pretty clear discussion, recommendation that says almost dollar for dollar, if you add staff, in theory, you could reduce the overtime by roughly the same amount. That was one thing you said. And with police, you had said something to the effect of that there may be some discussion worth having or study worth having further about calls for service as it relates to a number of folks on the force or in a given shift. Understanding that's not the primary scope, could you discuss that a little further?
Well, as I said, we only had limited access to information, but in the limited information that we did get, It's always worthwhile to do that. I mean, but where you were going to start of that question was related to the difference between police and fire. And what we did not do in fire is challenge you've got too many people on duty or too few people on duty in this final version of the report. That there are some reasons for the on-duty staffing levels being what they are. There's reasons for having it be different between day and night, but it wasn't in a study of this scope, we couldn't see how you fit into the whole regional network. Can you rely on neighboring fire departments in a big fire to help you better meet the national standards that are out there? So on the police side, we've got a little bit different situation because whatever you got in fire is what you're committed to, and you're going to have that fixed number of staff out there. On police, you've got a relief factor built into it. And so I think the interesting issue there, it relates to things like you're not going to be, unlike fire, at the minimum staffing levels every shift. So what are the circumstances, and what is the magnitude and the reality of staffing at different levels than minimum staffing? And that requires just a lot more complicated analysis than we were able to do for an overtime study such as this.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments?
Your Honor, what I would like to do is, I'd like, obviously, the City Council have the opportunity to review this report. The idea of this report coming before the budget isn't to have, like Mr. Brady said, to have a magic bullet here. The idea of this report is to really take a look at it, and after the budget, after we start preparing for our collective bargaining, it's going to be important that working with the city negotiator, working with our boards and commissions, that we look through some of these areas that will have our biggest impact. Now, one of the things, just as an example of what can happen out of collective bargaining, is in 1996, this council held firm and said that certain payouts at the end on accumulated sick time would not happen anymore, and it was collectively bargained for anybody that was hired after 1996 wouldn't receive that benefit. So on a period of an actuarial basis of 10 years, we've started to phase out that liability that we've had. And so the same thing has to happen in this. You have to realize that many of these contracts have evolved over 30 years. And so when you collectively bargain them, you're going to have to do it in such a way, it may look like a long horizon to you now, but certainly in 1996, that horizon looked long as well. But I will tell you, we are saving substantial sums of money today as a result of that stance was taken by the council back then to uniformly look at all 15 collective bargaining agreements to eliminate that benefit. In addition, we've done such things over time as to reduce the number of holidays. So we've also increased the premium share with employees. So over time, on the one hand, from the 70s forward, there were added benefits. On the other hand, from the late 90s forward, we've now been collectively bargaining and adjusting those benefits. And the way to look at it is long-term horizons so that you actuarially deal with those issues. Because it's collective bargaining. So I think that's something that will be the most important thing that comes out of this report. So I just want to say one more thing, Your Honor. I want to thank David Moore from the community development staff who helped coordinate this project. And I want to say he did a great job of bringing it all together. And over this past few days, we were just having information going back and forth, and every department worked with David, and he did a fabulous job, and I want to publicly thank him for that work.
He was a very effective shepherd for us during that whole process.
Good shepherding. The Assistant Mayor.
I do have a question. Having received this binder and obviously wanting an opportunity to review it, because I think the questions would be more meaningful than after a executive summary type presentation, is there going to be an opportunity for us to go into greater depth? Is that part of the scope of work?
Well, if I might, Your Honor, we were able to negotiate the fee less than what was originally intended, and so what I would suggest is that once we get through the budget, and we'll have to talk about this with Matrix, is maybe bring them back for another discussion after you have time to review this. I think the best discussion of this will happen right before you're prepared to go in and talk to Tom Flygar about your collective bargaining. So what we'll do is we will talk to Mr. Brady about the issue, and like I said, we were able to negotiate the price lower than what was budgeted, and what was, so we would be able to bring them back. So that, if that's kind of the course that you'd like me to take, and my suggestion is not to, over the next 30 to days, you're going to be extremely busy on a number of things. The budget being the most important. But one thing I would say is that when we get into that area of talking about collective bargaining long term, I think that would be helpful to have them come back.
Very good. Okay, Councilor Reynolds?
Yeah, I'd just like to offer a kind of a closing comment, at least from my perspective. Really appreciate the presentation, appreciate the work that was done on it by yourself, John, and David, you mentioned, and of course all the department heads and everybody. It looks like some great information. Just again from my own perspective, the city council, I don't think, certainly we did not request this study because we thought that there were some flagrant abuses of overtime going on or really badly managed departments in our city. We know that we have a very professional, responsible, city manager on down, department heads. So it wasn't, that was not the motivation. The motivation from my perspective is, as everybody recognizes, times are tight, and from the budget that we've put together, we see what we're faced with, difficulty of making some difficult choices perhaps, and we should always, all of us should always be trying to see how we can do better at managing to get the most out of every dollar, so came up with a number of things that are in CBAs, and we're going to work on those on the longer time horizon that John said, but there are some other things that are identified as if you had a better tracking system, if you had more reporting on this, you could at least start to better understand it, and then the next step from understanding it is better managing it. So incremental steps, there is certainly is no silver bullet. There's no, oh, hey, we found out that, geez, over here, this is costing you huge. There's nothing like that. But better management, incremental improvement, because that's what we're going to, when we talk about where we're going to hold the line on the budget or get to the tax rate, we are talking about increments, and every little bit counts, that's all. So.
Councilor Panalakos.
I think this report is very good, and I just would like to say that as a council, as a city employee, or anyone else within the city that is paid, they're paid by the taxpayer, and we need to save every penny we can. They're hurting out there, whether they're rich or poor now, they're beginning to hurt. And anything that we do to improve anything, it should be the department heads, the council, every school board, everyone working together to save money for the taxpayer, not looking at one department, every department.
Thank you. I saw another hand or two, I thought. Maybe not. Okay. And with that, I appreciate again you coming down here and everybody watching at home and being here, as well as the council. So until then, we'll see you soon. Thanks very much. Have a good night.